The moment Colt Thatcher saw the delicate footprints trailing through the fresh morning snow outside the saloon in White River, South Dakota, something twisted hard in his chest, because whoever made those tracks had been running, and the uneven gait told him she was hurt. December of 1882 had blown into the Dakota Territory with a vengeance, bringing snowstorms that could bury a man standing upright and winds that cut through leather and wool like a skinning knife. Colt pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders and crouched down to examine the tracks more closely. Small boots, worn thin at the heels, and between every third and fourth step, a drag mark where she'd stumbled or her leg had given out. Droplets of crimson dotted the pristine white surface, stark as sin against the virgin snow. He'd ridden into White River 3 days prior, looking for honest work after a summer of driving cattle north from Texas. The town sat along the White River itself, a cluster of wooden buildings that seemed to huddle together against the brutal winter winds that swept down from the Badlands. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, which suited Colt just fine. At 26 years old, he'd seen enough trouble to last him several lifetimes, and all he wanted now was a quiet season to earn his keep and maybe save enough to buy a small spread of his own come spring. But those footprints changed everything. Colt rose to his full height of 6 feet 2 inches, his gray eyes scanning the direction the tracks led. Away from town, toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the river's edge. Anyone heading out there in this cold without proper preparation was either desperate or foolish, and given the blood in the snow, he suspected it was the former. He went back inside the boarding house where he'd taken a room, grabbed his heavy buffalo coat, extra blankets, and the provisions he kept in his saddlebag. Mrs. Chen, the Chinese woman who ran the establishment, watched him with knowing eyes as he moved with swift purpose. "Someone in trouble?" she asked in her precise English. "Looks that way, madam," Colt replied, checking that his revolver was loaded more out of habit than expectation of needing it. "You are a good man, Mr. Thatcher," she said simply. "I will have hot food and water ready when you return." He nodded his thanks and stepped back into the bitter cold. The wind had picked up, which meant those tracks would be covered within the hour if the weather turned worse. Colt moved quickly but carefully, following the trail as it wound between buildings, and then out into the open country beyond town. The footprints led him past the last outlying barn and into a grove of bare cottonwoods whose branches clicked together in the wind like skeleton fingers. The blood drops came more frequently now, and Colt felt his jaw tighten with concern. Whoever this woman was, she was in bad shape. The tracks veered suddenly to the left, heading down the embankment toward the frozen river. Colt followed, his boots crunching through the crusted snow, and that's when he saw her. She was huddled beneath an overhanging section of the riverbank, partially concealed by a fallen cottonwood. Her dress was torn and inadequate for the weather, a thin wool shawl clutched around her shoulders. Dark hair spilled from beneath a tattered bonnet, and even from 20 feet away, Colt could see she was shivering violently. "Madam," he called out, not wanting to startle her. "I'm not here to hurt you. I saw your tracks and followed to see if you needed help." Her head snapped up, and Colt found himself looking into the most striking pair of green eyes he'd ever seen. They were the color of new spring grass, vivid and bright, even in her pale, frightened face. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with delicate features that were currently pinched with cold and pain. "Stay back," she said, her voice hoarse but defiant. "I have a knife." She did indeed have a small blade clutched in her right hand, though Colt noticed her grip was weak, and her left arm was pressed tight against her side, blood seeping through her fingers. "I can see that," he said calmly, stopping where he was and slowly setting down the bundle he carried. "And I respect that you know how to defend yourself. But madam, you're bleeding and half frozen. I've got warm blankets here and provisions. I'm staying at Mrs. Chen's boarding house in town. She's got hot food and a fire going. Let me help you." "I can't go back to town," the woman said quickly, fear flashing across her face. "They'll find me there." Colt absorbed this information with a slight nod. "Who's looking for you?" She pressed her lips together, clearly debating whether to trust him. Colt stayed perfectly still, letting her make the decision. He'd worked with enough spooked horses to know that pushing now would only drive her away. Finally, she spoke. "My husband, former husband, he doesn't see it that way." The words came out bitter and pained, and Colt felt anger kindle in his gut. He'd seen this before, men who thought ownership came with marriage vows, who used their fists to enforce their will. Did he do that? Colt gestured to her injured side. She nodded slowly. "I waited until he was drunk last night and then I ran. I took the first horse I could find and rode until it threw me about a mile back. I've been walking since dawn." "That was brave," Colt said, meaning it, "and smart, but you need medical attention and you need to get warm." "I promise you I won't let anyone hurt you. You have my word." "I don't know you," she whispered, but there was a desperate hope in her eyes that told Colt she wanted to believe him. "No, madam, you don't. My name is Colt Thatcher. I'm a cattleman from Texas, just passing through for the winter. I've got no stake in whatever trouble you're running from, but I can't in good conscience leave an injured woman out here to freeze." She studied his face for a long moment, and Colt let her look. He knew what she'd see: a weathered face browned by sun and wind, a straight nose that had been broken once and healed crooked, a jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble, and eyes that he hoped conveyed sincerity. "Deanna," she said finally. "Deanna Sawyer." "Miss Sawyer," Colt acknowledged. "Will you let me help you?" Diana's resistance crumbled as another violent shiver racked her body. She nodded, and Colt moved forward slowly, giving her time to change her mind. When he reached her side, he could see that the injury was a knife wound, probably from trying to defend herself. It needed cleaning and stitching, but it wasn't immediately life-threatening if they acted quickly. He draped one of the heavy blankets around her shoulders and carefully helped her to her feet. Deanna swayed against him, her strength clearly depleted, and Colt caught her with a steady arm around her waist. "I've got you," he said quietly. "Just lean on me." The walk back to town took twice as long as the journey out, with Colt supporting most of Deanna's weight. She tried to stay alert, scanning the streets nervously as they entered White River, but exhaustion and blood loss were taking their toll. Colt guided her to the back entrance of Mrs. Chen's boarding house, and the older woman met them at the door as if she'd been watching for their return. "This is Deanna Sawyer," Colt said simply. "She needs medical attention and a safe place to stay." Mrs. Chen's sharp eyes took in the situation instantly. "Bring her to the room at the end of the hall upstairs. It has a lock on the inside of the door. I will fetch Dr. Morrison." Together, they got Deanna upstairs and settled on the narrow bed. Mrs. Chen returned minutes later with the doctor, a gruff man in his 50s who asked no questions and simply set about cleaning and stitching the wound. Deanna bore it with gritted teeth, her hand gripping Colt's with surprising strength. When the doctor finished and departed with instructions for changing the bandage and watching for fever, Mrs. Chen brought up hot soup and bread. Deanna ate slowly, color gradually returning to her cheeks. "Why are you helping me?" she asked Colt, who'd taken up a position by the window, watching the street below. "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered, "and because nobody deserves to be hurt by someone who's supposed to protect them." "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," Deanna said, her voice small. "My husband, Wallace Granger, he's a powerful man in these parts. He owns most of the land around here, and the sheriff is in his pocket." Colt turned from the window to look at her. "How long were you married to him?" 2 years, Deanna said, staring down at her soup. "My father owed him money. When Pa died, Wallace offered to forgive the debt if I'd marry him. I was 18 and stupid enough to think it was romantic, that he wanted me for me, but he just wanted property he could control." The bitterness in her voice cut through Colt like a blade. "And the law won't help you," Deanna laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Wallace is the law around here. When I went to the sheriff 6 months ago, covered in bruises, he told me that a husband has rights to discipline his wife, and I should learn to be more obedient." Colt felt his hands curl into fists. He'd spent his life trying to be a peaceful man, but stories like this made violence seem justified. "Then we'll have to figure out another solution." Deanna looked up at him with those startling green eyes. "You should walk away from this, Mr. Thatcher. You seem like a decent man." "There's no reason for you to risk yourself for a stranger." "Maybe not," Colt agreed, "but I'm going to anyway." The look Deanna gave him then was complicated, a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite name. Before either of them could speak again, Mrs. Chen knocked softly and entered. "Mr. Thatcher, there is a man downstairs asking about a missing woman. He has several men with him and they are armed." Colt and Deanna's eyes met. "That'll be Wallace," Deanna whispered, fear draining the color from her face again. "Stay here," Colt said firmly. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me or Mrs. Chen." "He'll hurt you," Deanna protested. "He'll try," Colt said with a thin smile. "I'm harder to hurt than I look." He checked his revolver and headed downstairs, hearing the lock click behind him. In the boarding house's small common room, a well-dressed man in his 40s stood with 3 ranch hands flanking him. Wallace Granger had the look of someone who'd grown soft in his prosperity, with a thick middle and jowls beginning to form beneath his beard. But his eyes were hard and cold. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Colt asked mildly, positioning himself at the base of the stairs. Wallace's gaze raked over him dismissively. "I'm looking for my wife. She's a disturbed woman, prone to fits and wandering. Dark hair, green eyes, about 5.5 feet tall. Have you seen her?" "Can't say I have," Colt replied. "Why would she be here? Her tracks led to this part of town," one of the ranch hands said. "We know she came this way." "Lots of people come through town," Colt said with a shrug. "Snow's covering tracks pretty quick today, though. Hard to say where anyone might have gone." Wallace stepped closer, his expression darkening. "Listen, Cowboy, I don't know who you are, but this is family business. If you're hiding Deanna, you're breaking the law. She's my wife, and I have every right to take her home." "Funny thing about that," Colt said, his voice remaining calm but his stance shifting slightly, ready for trouble. "From what I understand, a woman who runs away bleeding into a snowstorm isn't looking to be found. Seems to me she's made her feelings clear." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Wallace's face flushed red with anger. "So you admit you've seen her?" "I admit nothing," Colt said. "I'm just speaking generally about the kind of situation you're describing. Now, I think it's time for you gentlemen to leave. This is a respectable boarding house, and you're disturbing the peace." One of the ranch hands moved his hand toward his gun, but Wallace held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't over, Cowboy. When I find out you've been helping my property escape, you'll answer for it. Your property." Colt's voice went cold and hard as winter steel. "Last I checked, we fought a war to establish that human beings can't be property. Maybe that news hasn't reached these parts yet." Wallace's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're making a powerful enemy, stranger." "Wouldn't be the first time," Colt replied. The standoff lasted another tense moment before Wallace turned on his heel and strode out, his men following. But the look he cast over his shoulder promised retribution. Mrs. Chen, who'd been watching from the kitchen doorway, came forward once they'd gone. "That man is dangerous, Mr. Thatcher." "I know," Colt said, "but so am I when I need to be." He returned upstairs and knocked softly on Deanna's door. "It's Colt. They're gone." The lock clicked and Deanna opened the door, her face anxious. "What happened?" "I told them I hadn't seen you," Colt said. "They're suspicious, but they left. For now." Deanna sank down onto the bed, looking defeated. "He'll be back, and he'll bring the sheriff next time, maybe more men." "You should let me go, let me keep running. In your condition," Colt shook his head, "you'd be dead of infection or cold within 2 days. No, we need a better plan." "There is no better plan," Deanna said hopelessly. "Wallace owns everything and everyone. The only way I'll ever be free of him is if one of us dies, and I don't think I'm capable of murder, no matter how much I might want to be." Colt pulled up the room's single chair and sat down, thinking hard. "What if you weren't Deanna Granger anymore?" She looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if there was a way to make that marriage legally void? Then you wouldn't be his wife and he'd have no claim on you." "How?" Deanna asked, but there was a spark of hope in her voice. "We were married by a proper preacher with witnesses and everything." "Was there a marriage license filed with the territorial government?" Colt asked. Deanna frowned, thinking back. "I don't know. Everything happened so fast. Wallace arranged it all. I just showed up and signed what he told me to sign." "Then it's possible the marriage was never legally recorded," Colt said, ideas forming. "If there's no official record, then legally, you were never married." "But Wallace has papers," Deanna protested. "He showed them to me once when I threatened to leave." "Papers can be forged or manipulated, especially out here where record keeping isn't always reliable," Colt pointed out. "I have a friend in Rapid City who works in the territorial courthouse. If I can get word to him, he might be able to check the records and see what's actually on file." Deanna looked at him with dawning hope, but also confusion. "Why are you doing all this? You don't even know me." Colt met her eyes steadily. "Maybe I'm tired of seeing strong people beaten down by those with power. Maybe I think everyone deserves a chance at freedom. Does the reason matter so much?" "It matters to me," Deanna said softly. "I've spent 2 years with a man who only did things for his own benefit. I don't understand kindness without strings attached anymore." "There are no strings," Colt assured her. "You heal up, we figure out your legal situation, and then you go wherever you want to go. You don't owe me anything." Deanna studied him for a long moment, and Colt felt something shift in the air between them. She was beautiful, he couldn't deny that, but it was more than that. There was a strength in her, a refusal to break despite everything she'd endured that drew him in ways he didn't fully understand. "Thank you," she said finally. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you, but thank you." Colt stood and moved toward the door. "Get some rest. I'll see about getting a message to Rapid City." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Colt spent his days working odd jobs around town to earn his keep and avoid suspicion, always returning to check on Deanna. Mrs. Chen proved to be a fierce protector, turning away anyone who asked too many questions and providing Diana with everything she needed. Diana's wound healed slowly but steadily under Dr. Morrison's care. The doctor, it turned out, had his own reasons for disliking Wallace Granger and was happy to keep his patient's presence quiet. As Diana regained her strength, she began helping Mrs. Chen with the boarding house work, insisting she needed to earn her keep. Colt found himself looking forward to the evenings when he'd sit with Diana in her room, both of them talking about their lives as the winter wind howled outside. He learned that she'd grown up on a small farm, that her mother had died when she was young, and that she'd had dreams once of becoming a teacher. "I loved learning," Deanna said one evening, her eyes distant with memory. "My mother taught me to read before she passed, and after that, I read everything I could get my hands on. The school teacher in our town used to lend me books. I thought maybe someday I could do that for other children." "What stopped you?" Colt asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Pa got sick, and then came the debt, and then Wallace," Deanna said simply. "Dreams have a way of dying when you're just trying to survive." "Dreams don't die," Colt said. "They just go dormant sometimes, like seeds waiting for spring." Deanna smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her face. "That's almost poetic, Mr. Thatcher. Where did a Texas cattleman learn to talk like that?" Colt felt his ears heat slightly. "My mother was a school teacher, actually. She used to read to us kids every night, poetry and stories. I guess some of it stuck." "Tell me about her," Deanna urged. And so Colt found himself talking about his family, about growing up on a small ranch, about losing both his parents to cholera when he was 19 and having to sell the land to pay their debts. "I've been drifting ever since," he admitted. "Working cattle drives, taking odd jobs, never staying in one place too long. I kept telling myself I was waiting to save enough for my own place, but maybe I was just running from memories." "There's no shame in grief," Deanna said gently, "or in needing time to heal." Their eyes met in the lamplight, and Colt felt something in his chest constrict. He was falling for this woman, he realized with a start. Not just attracted to her beauty, but drawn to her spirit, her resilience, the way she refused to be defeated by circumstances that would have broken lesser people. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. He'd promised to help her get free, not to complicate her life further with his own feelings. She needed time to heal, to figure out who she was outside of the nightmare Wallace had created. But then Deanna reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and the touch sent electricity racing up his arm. "Colt," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I think I'm falling in love with you," Deanna said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it's too soon, and I know I'm probably just confused because you saved me and you're being kind, but I can't stop thinking about you. When you're gone during the day, I count the hours until you come back. And I know that's not fair to you to put that on you when you've already done so much." Colt turned his hand over so their palms met, his fingers curling around hers. "Deanna, I've been fighting the same feelings, but I didn't want to say anything because I thought you needed time and space." "I've had 2 years of time and space in a prison of Wallace's making," Deanna said fiercely. "I know what it feels like to be with someone who makes me feel small and afraid, and I know that what I feel when I'm with you is the exact opposite. You make me feel safe and seen and like myself again." "You're sure?" Colt asked, searching her face. "Because I don't want you feeling obligated or grateful. Those aren't the same as love." "I'm sure," Deanna said, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like the first thaw of spring after a hard winter. But then Deanna's hand came up to cup Colt's jaw, and he pulled her closer, deepening the kiss. She tasted like the peppermint tea Mrs. Chen had brought up, sweet and warm, and Colt felt like he was falling and flying all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. "We'll figure this out," he promised. "Whatever it takes, we'll find a way for you to be free, really free." "I believe you," Deanna whispered. The next morning brought news. A rider arrived from Rapid City with a message for Colt. His friend at the courthouse had done some digging, and what he'd found was explosive. There was no record of a marriage license between Deanna Sawyer and Wallace Granger. Moreover, The preacher who'd supposedly performed the ceremony had been defrocked years earlier and had no legal authority to perform marriages. "What does this mean?" Deanna asked, her hands trembling as she held the letter. "It means you were never legally married," Colt said, a grin spreading across his face. "Wallace has been lying to you, holding you prisoner with fake documents. You're a free woman, Deanna." Deanna sank down onto the bed, tears streaming down her face. But they were tears of joy and relief, not sorrow. "I'm free," she whispered. "I'm actually free." Colt knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "There's more. My friend says that if you're willing to testify about what Wallace did, holding you against your will and assault, there are federal marshals who would be interested in the case. Wallace has apparently been running roughshod over the law for years, and there are people looking for a reason to bring him down." "I'll testify," Deanna said immediately. "I'll tell them everything." "It won't be easy," Colt warned. "He'll fight back, try to discredit you." "Let him try," Deanna said, her chin lifting with determination. "I'm not afraid anymore, not with you beside me." But Wallace didn't wait for federal marshals to arrive. 2 nights later, Colt woke to the sound of breaking glass downstairs. He was up and dressed in seconds, his gun in his hand as he moved into the hallway. Deanna's door opened, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay in your room and lock the door," Colt commanded, but Deanna shook her head. "I won't hide anymore," she said. "If Wallace is here, I'm facing him." There was no time to argue. Colt heard heavy footsteps on the stairs and pushed Deanna behind him as Wallace appeared, flanked by 2 of his men. All 3 were armed. "There you are," Wallace said, his words slurred with whiskey. "My darling wife hiding behind another man." "Do you know what that makes you, Deanna?" "It makes me smart," Deanna shot back. "I was never your wife, Wallace. There's no legal record of our marriage. That preacher you paid off had no authority. You've been holding me prisoner with lies." Wallace's face contorted with rage. "You're mine. I paid for you fair and square when I cleared your father's debt. You belong to me." "People don't belong to other people," Colt said coldly, his gun leveled at Wallace's chest. "And you're trespassing. I suggest you leave before someone gets hurt." "You think you can steal from me and get away with it?" Wallace snarled. "I run this town. I could have you shot dead right here and the sheriff would rule it self-defense." "Except there are witnesses," Mrs. Chen said from the bottom of the stairs. Behind her stood Dr. Morrison and several other residents of the boarding house, all of them watching with hostile eyes. Too many witnesses for even a corrupt sheriff to ignore. Wallace looked around, realizing he'd been outmaneuvered, but desperation made him reckless. He lunged forward, grabbing for Deanna, and Colt's gun barked once in the close confines of the hallway. Wallace stumbled back with a cry, clutching his shoulder where Colt's bullet had torn through muscle. His men raised their own weapons, but Colt had already cocked his revolver again, and the other boarders surged up the stairs, some of them armed as well. "It's over, Wallace," Colt said quietly. "You can leave now and get that wound treated, or you can push this further and see how it ends. Your choice." For a long moment Wallace stood there bleeding and furious, but finally self-preservation won out over pride. "This isn't finished," he hissed. "Not by a long shot." "Actually, it is," a new voice said from the front door. A man in a federal marshal's badge stood there, along with 2 deputies. "Wallace Granger, you're under arrest for fraud, assault, and unlawful imprisonment. We've been building a case against you for months, and thanks to some new testimony that arrived from Rapid City, we've got everything we need." The next hour was a blur of activity as the marshals took Wallace and his men into custody. Colt learned that his friend at the courthouse had been working with federal authorities who were investigating land fraud throughout the territory, and Wallace's fake marriage was just one of many crimes they could now prove. Diana gave her statement to the marshals, her voice steady and clear as she detailed 2 years of abuse and captivity. Colt stood beside her the whole time, his presence a silent support. When it was finally over and the marshals had left with their prisoners, Diana and Colt found themselves alone in her room as dawn began to break outside the window. She collapsed against him, exhausted but triumphant. "It's really over," she said, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "It's really over," Colt confirmed, holding her close. "You're free, Diana, completely free." She pulled back to look up at him, her green eyes bright. "So what happens now?" Colt took a deep breath, knowing this was a moment that would define the rest of his life. "Well, I was thinking about what you said about dreams going dormant, and I realized I've let my own dreams sleep for too long." "What dreams are those?" Diana asked softly. "I want to buy land," Colt said. "Not a huge spread, just enough for a small ranch. Maybe raise cattle, maybe horses. Build a real home, not just drift from place to place. But I don't want to do it alone." He paused, then plunged ahead. "Diana, I know we've only known each other a few weeks, and I know you've been through hell. If you need time, I'll give you all the time in the world. But I need you to know that I love you. I love your strength and your courage and the way you refuse to be broken. I love talking to you and listening to your stories and just being in the same room with you. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life showing you what love is supposed to look like." Diana's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Are you asking me to marry you, Colt Thatcher?" "I am," Colt said, his heart pounding. "Though I don't have a ring, and I can't promise you anything fancy. Just hard work and honesty and a love that won't quit." "That's all I ever wanted," Diana said, and then she kissed him with all the passion and promise of a new beginning. They were married in the spring of 1883, as soon as the snows melted and the prairie came alive with wildflowers. Mrs. Chen hosted the wedding at the boarding house, and half the town turned out to celebrate. Dr. Morrison walked Diana down the aisle since she had no family left, and the pride on his face was unmistakable. Colt wore his best suit, purchased specially for the occasion, and when Diana appeared in a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen and the other women had sewn for her, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. She was beautiful, radiant with happiness, and she was choosing him. Their vows were simple and heartfelt. Colt promised to honor and cherish Diana, to build a life worthy of her trust, to be her partner in all things. Diana promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges came, to build something beautiful from the ashes of her past, to love him with her whole heart. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Colt kissed Diana with all the joy and relief of a man who'd found something he hadn't even known he was searching for. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in the same room where Diana had healed and where their love had first bloomed. But it felt different now, charged with promise and possibility. "Are you happy?" Colt asked as they lay together in the darkness, Diana's head on his chest and his arms wrapped around her. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Diana said, pressing a kiss over his heart. "When I was running through that snow, I thought my life was over. I never imagined it was actually just beginning." "We'll make it good," Colt promised. "Whatever life we build, it'll be good." "I know," Diana said with absolute certainty, "because we're building it together." Over the following months, Colt worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life. He took every job he could find, saving every penny toward their dream of owning land. Diana worked alongside him, taking in sewing and helping Mrs. Chen, her own earnings added to their growing nest egg. In the evenings, they would sit together and plan their future. Colt drew rough sketches of the house he wanted to build, While Deanna planned gardens and talked about maybe starting that school she'd always dreamed of once they were settled. "There are children all over these territories who need education," she said one night, her eyes alight with passion. "Children of homesteaders and ranchers who are too far from town for regular schooling. I could travel to them, or maybe we could build a schoolhouse on our land." "We'll build whatever you want," Colt said, loving the way her face glowed when she talked about teaching. "Our land, our rules." Wallace Granger, meanwhile, faced justice for his crimes. The trial was swift and the evidence overwhelming. He was sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison for fraud and assault. His lands were seized and sold to settle his debts, including the money he'd claimed Deanna's father owed him, which turned out to be grossly inflated. Deanna attended the sentencing, sitting straight and proud in the courtroom as the judge handed down his verdict. When Wallace was led away in chains, he looked at her with impotent fury, but Deanna met his gaze without flinching. That chapter of her life was closed forever. By the late summer of 1883, Colt and Deanna had saved enough to make a down payment on a beautiful piece of land about 10 miles west of White River. It sat in a valley with good water access from a creek that fed into the White River, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by surrounding hills. There was timber for building and grazing land for cattle or horses. The day they signed the deed, making the land officially theirs, Deanna cried tears of joy. "It's really ours," she kept saying. "Land that belongs to us that no one can take away." "Ours," Colt confirmed, pulling her into his arms. "A place to put down roots and grow." They spent the rest of the summer and fall building their home. It was modest by some standards, just 4 rooms to start, but every log and nail was placed with love and care. Neighbors came to help with the barn raising, and Deanna made friends with the other ranch wives in the area, women who respected her strength and welcomed her warmth. By the time the first snows fell in late November, they were snug in their completed house with a good supply of firewood and provisions. Colt had purchased a small herd of cattle and several horses, the beginning of their ranch operation. On a cold December morning, exactly 1 year after Colt had found Deanna's footprints in the snow, he woke to find her watching him with a peculiar expression on her face. "What is it?" he asked, instantly alert for trouble. "I'm pregnant," Deanna said, and then she smiled with such joy that it took Colt's breath away. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday when I went into town. We're going to have a baby." Colt let out a whoop of joy and gathered Deanna into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Deanna asked, though she could clearly see the answer on his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Colt said. Terrified, amazed, grateful, excited, all of those and more. They spent the winter preparing for their new arrival, Colt building a cradle from smooth pine wood and Deanna sewing tiny clothes. The months passed in a blur of anticipation and planning, their love deepening with each passing day. Their son was born in early August of 1884, arriving with the sunrise and a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Colt held Deanna's hand through the long hours of labor, and when Dr. Morrison finally placed the squalling infant in his arms, he felt his heart expand in ways he'd never imagined possible. "He's perfect," Colt said, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel, after Colt's father, with the middle name of James for Deanna's. Little Samuel had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and from his first moments, he was curious about everything, his eyes tracking movement and sound with intense interest. Parenthood was both harder and more rewarding than either of them had anticipated. There were sleepless nights and constant worry, but also moments of such profound joy that they seemed almost holy. Watching Deanna nurse their son, singing softly to him in the lamplight, Colt often found himself overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they'd built. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Colt proved to have a gift for breeding horses, and the Thatcher Ranch became known throughout the territory for producing quality animals. Deanna started her school, teaching not just children but any adults who wanted to learn to read and write. She held classes twice a week in their home, and it wasn't uncommon for Colt to come in from working to find his living room full of students of all ages, all hanging on Deanna's every word. In the spring of 1887, their daughter was born, a tiny thing they named Caroline after Colt's mother. She had her father's gray eyes and a temperament to match, fierce and independent from her first breath. Samuel, now nearly 3, was fascinated by his baby sister and took his role as big brother with utmost seriousness. Life fell into a rhythm of work and family, challenges and triumphs. There were hard years when drought threatened the cattle and harsh winters that tested their endurance. But they weathered every storm together, their love the constant that anchored them through all difficulties. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, Colt and Deanna would sit on the porch they'd added to the house, watching the sun set over their land. Sometimes they'd talk about their day, sharing stories and making plans. Other times they'd simply sit in comfortable silence, Diana's hand in Colt's, both of them reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. "You ever think about that morning?" Deanna asked one such evening in the summer of 1890. Samuel was 6 now and helping his father with the horses, while 3-year-old Caroline was likely dreaming of the kittens that had been born in the barn. "When you found my footprints in the snow." "Every day," Colt admitted. "Best decision I ever made following those tracks." "I was so scared that morning," Deanna said quietly. "I thought I was running toward my death. I never imagined I was running toward my life." Colt lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You were so brave, you still are." "We both are," Deanna corrected. "It takes courage to build something real, to open your heart knowing it can be broken." "My heart's in good hands," Colt said with a smile. In 1893, they welcomed another child, a son they named Thomas. His arrival was celebrated by the entire community, which had grown considerably over the years. White River was thriving, and the Thatcher Ranch was one of the most respected operations in the territory. Deanna's school had grown too, and she now had an assistant teacher, a young woman named Emily who'd come west seeking adventure and found purpose in education. Together, they taught dozens of children and adults, many of whom would go on to bring literacy and learning to their own families and communities. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Samuel grew into a fine young man who shared his father's love of horses and his mother's quick mind. Caroline proved to be a natural leader, organizing the other ranch children into elaborate games and adventures. Thomas was the family peacemaker, gentle and thoughtful, always ready with a hug or a kind word. In 1898, a reporter from a Rapid City newspaper came to interview Deanna about her school and the remarkable success rate of her students. The resulting article painted a picture of a woman who'd overcome tremendous adversity to build something beautiful and meaningful. "Mrs. Thatcher is living proof that our past doesn't determine our future," the reporter wrote. "From desperate beginnings, she has created not just a successful school but a genuine community of learners. Her story, and that of her partnership with her husband Colt, is the very embodiment of the American spirit. When the article was published, Diana blushed at the praise, but Colt was fiercely proud. "You earned every word of that," he told her. "Look at what you've built, what you've given to this community." "We've built it," Diana corrected. "Every student who walks through our door, every neighbor who comes to help with a barn raising, every bit of good in our lives, we built it together." Their children grew and eventually began their own journeys. Samuel married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, and they built a home on the far corner of the Thatcher land, continuing the family tradition of raising fine horses. Caroline shocked everyone by becoming one of the first female lawyers in the Dakota Territory, fighting for the rights of women and the disadvantaged. Thomas followed his mother's footsteps into teaching, eventually starting a school of his own in a settlement to the north. Through it all, Colt and Diana remained the constant center, their love the foundation upon which their family and community was built. They grew older together, silver threading through their hair and lines marking their faces, each one a testament to laughter shared and challenges overcome. On a December morning in 1915, 33 years after Colt had found Diana's footprints in the snow, they stood together on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. There were 7 of them now, ranging in age from 2 to 12, and their joy and energy filled the house with light. "Can you believe it's been 3 decades?" Diana asked, leaning against Colt's solid warmth. At 55, he was still strong and vital, though he moved a bit slower than he once had. Diana, at 53, had lost none of her fire or determination, though she'd finally agreed to reduce her teaching schedule to just 3 days a week. "Best 33 years of my life," Colt said, wrapping his arms around her. "Every single moment. Even the hard parts," Diana teased. "Especially the hard parts," Colt said seriously. "Because we faced them together. That's what love is, isn't it? Not just sharing the good times, but standing together when things get tough." Diana turned in his arms to face him, her green eyes still as bright and captivating as they'd been that cold morning when he'd found her huddled by the frozen river. "I love you, Colt Thatcher. I loved you then, I love you now, and I'll love you until my last breath." "And I love you, Diana Thatcher," Colt said, kissing her softly. "Following your footprints was following my heart, even though I didn't know it at the time. You led me straight to my future, to everything I never knew I needed." Little Caroline, their granddaughter, named for her aunt, came running up to the porch, her cheeks flushed from play. "Grandpa, Grandma, come see what we built in the snow." Hand in hand, Colt and Diana walked out to admire the snow fort their grandchildren had constructed, their laughter mingling with the children's voices. The sun shone bright in the winter sky, and smoke rose from the chimney of their home, carrying with it the scent of bread baking and coffee brewing. That evening, after the grandchildren had been collected by their parents and the house had settled into quiet, Diana found herself in the small library they'd added to the house years ago. She pulled out the journal she'd kept since those early days and began to write. "Today marks 33 years since Colt found me," she wrote in her careful script. 33 years since I was running scared and half frozen, convinced my life was over, how wrong I was, how beautifully, wonderfully wrong. My life was just beginning and I didn't even know it. I've learned so much in these years about love, about strength, about the power of choosing hope even in the darkest moments. I've learned that family isn't just blood, but the people who choose to stand beside you. I've learned that home isn't a place, but a feeling of safety and belonging. And I've learned that true love doesn't happen despite hardship, but often because of it, forged in the fires of shared struggle and emerging stronger than steel. If I could go back and speak to that terrified young woman running through the snow, I'd tell her to keep going, that rescue is coming, that love is waiting. I'd tell her that the footprints she's leaving are leading her home. Colt found her there, tears streaming down her face as she wrote, and gathered her close. "Happy tears?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The happiest," Deanna confirmed. "I was just thinking about how grateful I am. For you, for our children and grandchildren, for this life we've built. Sometimes it feels like too much happiness for one person to contain. Then it's a good thing you don't have to contain it alone," Colt said, kissing the top of her head. "We've got each other to share the load." They sat together in the peaceful quiet, surrounded by shelves of books and memories, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering the world in pristine white. In the years that followed, Colt and Deanna continued to be pillars of their community. They celebrated their children's successes and supported them through their challenges. They welcomed more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, each one carrying forward the legacy of love and resilience that defined the Thatcher family. In 1925, on their 42nd wedding anniversary, the town of White River held a celebration in their honor. The mayor gave a speech about how the Thatcher family had helped shape the community, about Deanna's school and Colt's contributions to the local ranching industry. But the most moving moment came when their children and grandchildren stood up, one by one, and shared what their parents and grandparents had taught them. Samuel spoke of his father's integrity and work ethic. Caroline talked about her mother's courage and determination. Thomas shared how both his parents had shown him that strength came in many forms, that gentleness was its own kind of power. By the time the last grandchild had spoken, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, and Colt and Deanna clung to each other, overwhelmed with gratitude and love. "We did good," Colt whispered to Deanna. "We did better than good," Deanna replied. "We built something that will last long after we're gone," and she was right. The values they'd instilled, the love they'd shared, and the community they'd helped build would continue to ripple outward for generations. In the winter of 1932, 50 years after that fateful December morning, Colt and Deanna sat once again on their porch. They were both in their 70s now, moving more slowly but still sharp in mind and warm in heart. The ranch was now run by Samuel and his sons, but Colt still went out to the barn every day to visit the horses. Deanna still tutored children who needed extra help, her passion for education undimmed by age. 50 years, Deanna said wonderingly. "Half a century since you found me." "Best tracking I ever did," Colt said with a smile. "Followed those footprints straight to paradise." "Our life hasn't been paradise," Deanna said with a laugh. "We've had our share of struggles." "Paradise isn't the absence of struggle," Colt said wisely. "It's having someone to struggle with, someone who makes every challenge worth facing." Deanna leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together as the sun set over the land they'd built their life upon. Their hands, weathered and marked by years of hard work, were intertwined, and their hearts beat in the comfortable rhythm of two people who'd truly become one. "If you had it to do over," Deanna asked, "would you still follow those footprints?" "Every single time," Colt said without hesitation. 100 lifetimes, and I'd follow them every time, because they led me to you and you're everything I never knew I was searching for." "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me," Deanna said, her eyes shining. "Then I haven't been doing my job right," Colt teased. "I should be telling you every day how much I love you, how you're the best thing that ever happened to me." "You do tell me," Deanna assured him. "Maybe not always in words, but in every action, every kindness, every moment we share." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast prairie sky, they went inside together, closing the door on another perfect day. The house was warm and filled with the scent of dinner cooking, and the sound of their great-grandchildren's laughter echoed from the living room where they were playing. This was their legacy, Colt thought as he looked around at the family gathered in their home. Not just the land or the buildings or the successful ranch and school, but this love multiplied and shared, creating ripples that would continue long after they were gone. In the spring of 1940, Colt passed away peacefully in his sleep, Deanna's hand in his. He was 84 years old and had lived a full, rich life. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched, and Diana stood strong and dignified through it all, though her heart was breaking. But even in grief, she found purpose. She compiled their story, writing it all down so that future generations would know the incredible journey that had begun with footprints in the snow. She included her journal entries, letters they'd written to each other, and photographs that documented their life together. Diana lived another 8 years, surrounded by family and continuing to teach until just months before her death. When she passed away in 1948 at the age of 86, she was buried beside Colt on a hill overlooking their ranch, under a stone that read, "Together they followed love's path from footprints in snow to forever." Their children made sure their story was preserved. The journal Deanna had kept, along with all their correspondence and photographs, was donated to the South Dakota Historical Society. Their house became a museum, carefully maintained by the family, and open to visitors who wanted to see how love and determination could build something lasting from the most desperate of beginnings. Decades later, schoolchildren throughout South Dakota would learn about Deanna Thatcher, the pioneering educator who'd overcome abuse and imprisonment to create educational opportunities for hundreds of students. They'd learn about Colt Thatcher, the cowboy who'd followed footprints in the snow and found not just a woman to rescue, but a partner who would help him build an empire of love and family. But more than the historical facts, what endured was the story itself, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of love, and the incredible places life can lead when you're brave enough to follow your heart. It was a story that reminded people that heroes come in ordinary forms, that love can bloom in the harshest of winters, and that sometimes the path to your future is written in the snow, waiting for you to be brave enough to follow it. The Thatcher Ranch continued to operate for generations, each new family adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that Colt and Deanna had built. The school Deanna founded evolved and grew, eventually becoming part of a larger educational network that brought learning to rural communities throughout the Dakotas. And on cold December mornings, when fresh snow covered the prairie, old-timers in White River would tell the story of the cowboy who'd found footprints outside a saloon and followed them to love. They'd speak of Diana's courage and Colt's steadfast devotion, of how two broken people had found each other and created something beautiful from their pain. It was a story that never got old, that inspired young lovers and reminded older couples of their own journeys. It was a story of the American West, of survival and determination, but more than that, it was a story of hope that even in our darkest moments, love can find us, that even when we're running scared and wounded, we might be running straight toward our destiny. The footprints in the snow had long since melted, but their legacy remained, carved not in stone but in the hearts and lives of everyone touched by the love story of Colt and Deanna Thatcher. It was proof that sometimes the best things in life come when we're brave enough to follow an uncertain path, that rescue can come from the most unexpected places, And that true love, once found, can weather any storm and last beyond a lifetime. And in the end, that was the real miracle of their story, not just that Colt had found Deanna, but that they'd found each other. Two souls destined to walk through life together, their paths converging on a cold December morning and never separating again. It was the kind of love that songs were written about, that novels tried to capture, that everyone hoped to find enduring, passionate, steadfast, and true. Their great-great-grandchildren would sit around fires and hear the tale of how their ancestors met, of footprints in snow and a love that conquered all obstacles. And they would carry forward the values that Colt and Deanna had lived by: courage in the face of adversity, kindness toward those in need, and above all, the belief that love, real love, was worth any sacrifice and could overcome any obstacle. The story that had begun with desperation and fear had transformed into a legacy of hope and love that would inspire generations. And somewhere, in whatever realm souls inhabit after this life, Colt and Deanna Thatcher walked together still, their hands joined, their love eternal, forever following the path that had begun with footprints in the snow and led them straight to forever.